To understand the Nepalese landraces, the first layer is geography. The Himalayan region does not permit agriculture to exist in abstract. Every crop reflects the terms set by terrain, altitude, and climate. Cannabis in Nepal is no exception. These landraces emerged in an ecological corridor that spans from subtropical foothills to high-altitude valleys where seasonal extremes define survival. The variation in elevation alone, ranging from just above 1,000 meters to beyond 3,000, creates a spectrum of microclimates that shaped cannabis into highly adaptive populations, each carrying traits aligned to specific environmental demands. At mid-altitudes, cannabis grows within valleys that retain daytime warmth, but shed heat rapidly after sundown. Nighttime temperatures often fall below what most equatorial cultivars tolerate. This cycle of warm days and cool nights becomes a form of natural selection, pressing plants to invest in resin production as a protective barrier against stress. Resin functions not only as a defense against ultraviolet exposure at altitude, but also as insulation against fluctuating temperatures. The heavy glandular coating that characterizes Nepalese cultivars is therefore not just a human preference, but an ecological necessity that the plant itself expressed under duress. At higher elevations, the challenges intensify. Thin air reduces available oxygen, slowing metabolic function, while the growing season shortens as frost risk arrives earlier in the year. In these zones, cannabis could not survive unless it developed resilience through narrow leaf morphology that minimized transpiration and maximized efficiency under limited resources. Plants often appear taller and less compact than modern commercial varieties, with elongated internodes and spindly frames. To an eye trained on dense hybrid buds, this growth might appear weak, but in the context of Himalayan agriculture, it represents precise adaptation. Tall frames allow more light capture across uneven terrain, while airy floral structures resist the mold pressure that develops in valleys when monsoon moisture lingers. Soils in Nepal add another dimension. Terraced farming, an ancient practice across the Himalayan slopes, means cannabis was frequently grown in loamy, well-draining earth, enriched by centuries of human cultivation. These terraces retain moisture during the wet season, yet drain enough to prevent root rot, giving cannabis conditions that encourage vigorous taproot development. Mineral content, particularly from alluvial deposits washed down by mountain streams, created variability between sites. This variability reinforced genetic diversity, as farmers saved seed not from uniform fields, but from scattered, environmentally responsive plants. Over generations, the seed stock embodied the geography itself, each valley, each slope, each terrace imprinting subtle differences into the cannabis grown there. This environmental shaping is the first definition of the Nepalese landraces. They cannot be reduced to a single plant form or chemical profile, because the mountains did not demand uniformity. Instead, they demanded resilience. They demanded resin as protection, elongated cycles as survival, and variation as insurance against uncertainty. The landrace in this context is not a fixed genetic product, but a living record of how cannabis negotiated with one of the harshest agricultural landscapes on Earth. The cultural significance of cannabis in Nepal is inseparable from the practice of producing charas. Unlike hashish traditions in regions such as Morocco or Afghanistan, where dried flowers are sifted and pressed, the Nepalese method depends on live plants. Farmers and collectors move through fields during the flowering stage, pressing the sticky resin directly from the plant surface onto their hands. The process is laborious and slow. Resin accumulates gradually as palms are rubbed together, forming a tar-like coating that is then shaped into small spheres or rolled into the larger temple balls for which Nepal is renowned. This method embeds human touch into the product itself, making charas not simply an extraction, but a cultural artifact created through intimate contact between cultivator and plant. Charas functions as both a social commodity and a religious sacrament. Within Hindu practice, it holds a long-standing association with devotion to Shiva, the ascetic deity often depicted with cannabis as a symbol of transcendence and divine connection. Charas is consumed in chillums during rituals and festivals, not as an act of intoxication alone, but as a means of aligning human consciousness with spiritual ideals. In this context, cannabis is elevated from crop to conduit, its resin viewed as a material capable of bridging the human and the divine. This religious framing distinguishes Nepalese Charas from purely recreational consumption models, positioning it as part of ritualized practice embedded deeply in the region's cultural identity. Socially, Charas also functions as a communal bond. In village contexts, its preparation and use create spaces of shared participation. The act of rubbing resin is not only agricultural labor, but also a point of cultural exchange, where knowledge of plant selection and harvesting passes between generations. Consumption, likewise, is structured communally. The chillum is passed from hand to hand, reinforcing trust, reciprocity, and continuity. This ritualized sharing transforms cannabis from an individual act into a collective experience, one that ties agricultural practice directly to social cohesion. The persistence of these traditions underscores that cannabis in Nepal was never evaluated primarily as a commodity measured in volume or yield. Instead, it was evaluated in terms of resin quality, ritual function, and social meaning. A plant that produced strong resin became part of the cultural record. Its seed preserved not just for agronomic reasons, but because of the role it played in religious observance and social continuity. This contrasts sharply with later commercial frameworks, where value is tied to yield per square meter or cannabinoid percentage. In Nepal, the measure of cannabis was whether its resin could sustain both devotion and community. From an anthropological standpoint, Charas production exemplifies the integration of cannabis into systems of meaning beyond agriculture. The resin is simultaneously labor product, religious sacrament, and social bond, and each of these roles is reinforced by the method of its creation. Because Charas requires direct human engagement with the living plant, it cannot be entirely mechanized or divorced from its cultural roots. This characteristic binds Nepalese landraces to their human context as tightly as to their environmental one, making them inseparable from the cultural landscapes that defined their selection. While the ritual role of Charas defines its cultural heart in Nepal, the material reality of resin production also established an economic system. Charas functioned as both a subsistence resource and a trade good, integrated into village economies and extending into broader networks of exchange. Within local communities, Charas was circulated much like grain or livestock products, an item with direct use value that could also be traded for other necessities. Farmers who produced resin beyond household need would offer it within village markets, where it served as a medium of exchange, not unlike cash crops in other regions. In this way, cannabis resin linked subsistence farming to forms of commerce without requiring the infrastructure of large-scale trade. Beyond the village level, Charas developed into a recognized commodity across regional networks. Traders moving through the Himalayas transported temple balls and smaller resin parcels into towns where exchange value expanded. Here, Charas was not only a religious item, but also a practical commodity. Merchants understood its durability, portability, and consistent demand, making it a reliable good in barter systems where cash was limited. The resin could travel further than raw agricultural produce, maintaining potency and form over long distances. This durability allowed Charas to circulate across valleys and even across national borders, embedding cannabis into the fabric of regional economies. Interaction with outsiders intensified these dynamics. By the mid-20th century, Nepal's reputation as a center of authentic cannabis culture drew foreign visitors, particularly during the 1960s and 1970s countercultural movement. Western demand for Charas reframed its value within Nepal, shifting it from a primarily cultural sacramental good to an item of export interest. Foreigners did not always engage with the ritual dimensions of Charas. Instead, they sought it as a high-quality product distinct from what was available in their own countries. This external demand created opportunities for local producers, but also disrupted traditional frameworks, as production increasingly responded to external consumption rather than local, ritual, or communal use. The government's response further illustrates the economic position of Charas. For decades, cannabis cultivation and resin production were tolerated as part of Nepal's agricultural and cultural identity. Markets selling charas operated openly in Kathmandu, and temple ball production became a visible symbol of Nepal's association with cannabis. However, international pressure in the late 20th century, particularly through treaties influenced by Western prohibitionist policies, led to a shift. By the late 1970s, open charas markets were shut down, and production was forced back into informal systems. This did not eliminate cannabis cultivation or resin exchange, but altered the social and economic contexts in which they occurred. Even with prohibition, the legacy of Charas and Nepalese landraces remains tied to exchange. At the village level, resin still circulates as a trade good, albeit more discreetly. On a larger scale, its reputation continues to carry economic weight in global cannabis discourse, where Nepalese temple balls are still spoken of as benchmarks of resin quality. The economic and social role of Charas illustrates how land races are not just shaped by environment and culture, but also by the flows of trade, regulation, and outside interaction. Their persistence reflects both the adaptability of the plant and the resilience of the communities that continue to produce and exchange it, even under shifting political and economic pressures. The trajectory of cannabis in Nepal cannot be understood without addressing the political and regulatory frameworks that reshaped its place in society. For centuries, cannabis cultivation and Charas production existed openly, woven into agricultural life and sanctioned by religious practice. Markets in Kathmandu sold resin without stigma, and state authorities treated cannabis as a plant aligned with cultural identity rather than contraband. This equilibrium began to fracture in the mid-20th century under the influence of international drug control regimes. The first significant pressure came through the 1961 United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which established cannabis alongside opiates and coca as a controlled substance requiring prohibition or strict regulation by signatory nations. Nepal, though historically tolerant of cannabis, was drawn into compliance as participation in international treaties became a condition for global recognition and aid. By the early 1970s, geopolitical dynamics sharpened. Western governments, particularly the United States, exerted direct influence over South Asian states to align their drug policies with prohibitionist standards. Cannabis, once normalized in Nepal, was reclassified under external pressure as a problem requiring eradication. The turning point arrived in 1973 when the Nepalese government, under pressure from U.S. diplomats and the emerging international drug control system, formally outlawed the commercial sale of cannabis. Shops in Kathmandu that had openly sold charas to both locals and foreigners were shut down. Cultivation and trade were criminalized, and police enforcement campaigns targeted markets that had previously functioned under state tolerance. This sudden shift was not driven by internal demand for prohibition, but by the necessity of aligning Nepal's policy with international frameworks to maintain aid and diplomatic relations. The consequences were immediate. For local farmers, prohibition meant the collapse of an open market system that had provided reliable income. Resin production did not cease, but it was forced into informal and illicit channels, eroding the transparency that once allowed cannabis to circulate as a legitimate commodity. For religious practitioners, the ban created tension between state law and cultural practice. Charas, long tied to devotion to Shiva and ritual continuity, was suddenly illegal, yet its role in religious life did not disappear. This created a duality. Cannabis persisted in temples and villages as sacrament while being criminalized in public markets. Adaptation followed. Farmers continued cultivating cannabis in remote valleys, away from direct state oversight, while charas production shifted into less visible circuits. International visitors, particularly in the decades following the ban, still sought Nepalese charas, sustaining a demand that kept production alive despite prohibition. The resilience of Nepalese landraces is demonstrated not only in their adaptation to environment, but in their survival under political suppression. Communities that relied on cannabis integrated secrecy into their agricultural calendars, balancing the risks of enforcement with the necessity of maintaining both cultural and economic practices. From a broader perspective, the prohibition of cannabis in Nepal illustrates the tension between global drug policy and local cultural sovereignty. What had been normalized for centuries was redefined in less than a decade under the weight of international treaties. The consequences were not the elimination of cannabis, but the transformation of its status from open cultural commodity to concealed practice. The persistence of Nepalese landraces today, despite decades of prohibition, is evidence of how deeply cannabis is rooted in both the environment and the culture of the Himalayas. The criminalization of cannabis in 1973 did not erase the plant from Nepal. It forced a transition from public acceptance to concealed survival. Farmers who had once cultivated openly in valley fields or sold charas in Kathmandu markets faced a sudden reclassification of their work as criminal activity. For many rural households, abandoning cannabis outright was not an option. Resin sales had supplemented subsistence farming, and Charas production had cultural value too deeply embedded to be discarded. The response was adaptation. Cultivation and exchange moved underground, adjusting to new conditions while preserving essential practices. At the village level, cannabis cultivation was shifted to remote plots and marginal lands. Instead of planting on terraces where crops could be observed easily, farmers pushed cannabis into forest clearings, higher slopes, or scattered fields where state oversight was minimal. This dispersal reduced visibility but preserved genetic continuity, as seed stock from traditional landraces continued to be replanted year after year. Unlike hybridized cultivars bred in secrecy elsewhere, Nepalese farmers maintained lineage through seed-saving traditions, ensuring that environmental adaptation and resin-heavy traits were not lost. Charas production also adapted. With public rubbing and open sale no longer tolerated, resin was processed in smaller, more discreet batches. Temple balls that once circulated through Kathmandu markets were now produced primarily for trusted networks, religious practitioners, close community members, and occasionally intermediaries who supplied foreign visitors. The ritual dimension of Charas provided a form of shield. Even under prohibition, cannabis retained legitimacy within Hindu devotion, where offerings to Shiva could not be policed with the same effectiveness as street markets. This dual role, illegal under state law but sacred under religious law, enabled Charas to persist in a liminal space, neither fully erased nor fully accepted. International demand further shaped the underground system. Tourists and countercultural travelers continued to seek Nepalese charas well after prohibition, creating a niche market that rewarded risk-taking farmers and traders. The government's ability to police rural areas was limited, and enforcement was often uneven, meaning that resin production survived in pockets where local authorities tolerated or overlooked cultivation. This informal tolerance created parallel economies, one official, aligned with prohibitionist policy, the other, unofficial, tied to cultural continuity and the steady pull of foreign interest. The post-ban era also redefined social exchange. Where charas had once been openly traded, exchange became increasingly based on trust and secrecy. Farmers and practitioners were cautious about who they shared resin with, limiting circulation to avoid exposure. This sharpened the role of charas as a cultural bond, reinforcing its use in closed circles, while simultaneously increasing its symbolic value. In effect, prohibition narrowed the scope of exchange, but intensified the depth of meaning within communities that continued to cultivate and consume. Anthropologically, this underground adaptation reveals the resilience of Nepalese landraces and the people who maintained them. Instead of being eradicated, the plant was absorbed into systems of secrecy that preserved its role while reducing its visibility. The genetic lines survived not in seed banks or commercial breeding projects, but in the hands of farmers who replanted in defiance of prohibition. The underground persistence of Nepalese cannabis demonstrates that prohibition was never fully effective. It merely pushed cannabis into less visible but equally enduring forms of cultivation and exchange. In the present era of cannabis legalization and regulated markets, Nepalese landraces occupy a paradoxical position. On one hand, they represent a genetic and cultural heritage with global recognition. On the other, they remain constrained by prohibitionist policies in their country of origin, where cultivation and trade remain criminalized under laws imposed in the 1970s. This divide highlights the gap between international narratives of cannabis progress and the local realities of communities that sustained the plant through centuries of cultural and agricultural practice. From a genetic standpoint, Nepalese landraces are of exceptional relevance to modern cannabis science. Contemporary breeding, particularly in North America and Europe, has produced a narrow genetic pool dominated by commercial hybrids. These hybrids emphasize short flowering cycles, dense bud formation, and high THC content, but often at the cost of diversity. Nepalese landraces, by contrast, embody traits that have been filtered through ecological adaptation rather than commercial demand. Extreme resin density, resilience to cold night temperatures, and chemical profiles distinct from mainstream hybrid cultivars. As climate variability challenges global agriculture, these traits represent a reservoir of adaptive potential that modern breeding cannot afford to overlook. In cultural terms, Nepalese cannabis remains a symbol of authenticity. The term Nepalese temple ball still circulates in global cannabis discourse as shorthand for artisanal, high-quality resin, even in markets where the product itself is absent. This symbolic weight demonstrates how cultural practices tied to land races continue to influence global perceptions of quality and tradition. Yet, within Nepal, those same practices remain legally suppressed, creating a situation where global culture valorizes what local policy continues to penalize. The result is a form of cultural displacement. The image of Nepalese cannabis circulates globally, while the communities that preserve it operate under legal risk. Preservation efforts underscore the tension further. International seed collectors and preservationists have attempted to secure Nepalese genetics by acquiring seed stock directly from local farmers. While this has ensured that elements of the landrace genome survive outside Nepal, it also raises ethical concerns about bioprospecting and cultural appropriation. Who owns the right to preserve, cultivate, or commercialize Nepalese genetics? When these seeds are grown and sold under foreign brand names, the economic benefits accrue to external actors, not to the communities that developed and sustained the landraces for centuries. This dynamic mirrors broader debates in agriculture, where indigenous and local cultivars are often commodified by outsiders without fair recognition or return. At the policy level, global shifts toward cannabis legalization present both opportunity and risk. Should Nepal move to reform its cannabis laws, the country could position itself as a center for heritage-based production, linking legal Charas and landrace cultivation to both cultural tourism and premium export markets. However, if prohibition persists, Nepal risks losing control of its own genetic heritage as foreign actors continue to capitalize on the reputation of Nepalese landraces. Preservation, therefore, is not simply a scientific or agricultural concern, but also a matter of cultural sovereignty and economic justice. The global relevance of Nepalese landraces today lies in this convergence of science, culture, and policy. They are genetic libraries in a narrowing cannabis gene pool. They are cultural artifacts embedded in rituals that resist erasure despite criminalization. And they are economic possibilities that remain unrealized under prohibition but increasingly visible in global debates about legalization and heritage recognition. The future of Nepalese cannabis will be determined not only by how well the plants adapt to shifting climates, but by how societies choose to reconcile preservation, respect, and regulation in the context of a plant that has always been more than a commodity. The story of Nepalese Landraces demonstrates how cannabis cannot be reduced to the simplified labels of Indica or Sativa. These cultivars emerged not from taxonomic categories, but from centuries of adaptation to environment, integration into culture, circulation through local economies, and survival under political suppression. Their defining feature was never a single leaf shape or growth pattern, but their resin, developed under the pressure of altitude and preserved through the cultural practice of Charas. To view them only through the lens of modern strain language is to miss the complexity of their history. By placing Nepalese cannabis within this broader frame, we see how landraces challenge the very foundation of the Indica sativa myth. They show that cannabis was not originally cultivated for flower traits or consumer-friendly categories, but for resin, ritual, and resilience. The contemporary cannabis industry, with its emphasis on strain branding and THC percentages, exists on top of this foundation, but often ignores it. Nepalese landraces remind us that cannabis is a plant defined by its interaction with people, place, and purpose, not by the oversimplified dichotomies used in dispensaries. This conclusion does not romanticize Nepalese cannabis as a relic of the past. It positions it as a resource for the future. In a time when commercial hybrids dominate global markets, heritage land races like those of Nepal remain critical for genetic diversity, cultural continuity, and authentic understanding of cannabis history. They embody the beyond the Indica sativa myth, evidence that cannabis cannot be fully understood without acknowledging its original cultivars, their environments, and the communities that shaped them. This video is produced for educational and cultural purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice, nor does it encourage the violation of local laws. Always consult and comply with the regulations in your jurisdiction before cultivating, consuming, or transporting cannabis. If this exploration into Nepalese landraces helped you see cannabis history more clearly, support this work by liking the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing. Each interaction helps keep this content alive and pushes back against the recycling of myths and half-truths in cannabis education. By joining this channel, you're helping to create space for fact-driven, culturally grounded narratives that move beyond labels and towards real understanding.